I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, who is, you may find it interesting or strange why we have, when we have a meeting where we have several people from the regions, from the Middle East and Africa, why we are starting with a European. Hans Joosten is a professor, or retired professor now, professor emeritus in the University of Greifswald in Germany, a founder of the Greifswald Meyer Center, and he is Dutch by origin. But we do it because this is how we look at, in this event, at wetlands of Africa and Middle East. We look from Europe, and this outlook to our heritage from Africa and Middle East is both an outlook from the science perspective, from the perspective of ecology and nature conservation, but also a cultural outlook. And Hans Joosten, my very good friend and teacher, is one of the main world experts in peatland ecology and conservation, but he's also a reader of all possible wetland books that you can imagine, and you can see them in the back of this photo. So he has also written stories together with Pim de Klerk, who is a co-author of these papers, about wetland perception in ancient cultures, the Middle East cultures. And this will be the main topic of your talk. Hans, the floor is yours. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you. Okay, marshes and wetlands in the testimony of ancient Middle Eastern or Near Eastern cultures. As Victor already said, we are both main board members of the International Meyer Conservation Groups. We do not like borders. This is a global network of some 700 people in 70 countries who want to maintain, conserve the diversity of Meyers and peatlands by conserving their functions and biodiversity and by ensuring their wise and sustainable use. These are very nice visions and aims, but an important question is, of course, how to do that. We are all aware that the societal perception of wetlands and peatlands is generally negative. We have in English many expressions that are negative, like bogged down or mired or swamped. And it is, of course, important to know where it is coming from. And one of the most famous authors in Germany, Goethe, has already said, you have to drain all peatlands. A swamp stretches along the mountains and pollutes all that has been gained. To drain the fall pool would be the highest thing to achieve. This is what since some 20, 30 years is called the Cinderella syndrome. Peatlands and wetlands, they are actually important, but their importance is not recognized. We see that also in the important environmental conventions. For the Ramsar Convention, peatlands and wetlands, specifically peatlands, are too dry. For the Convention on Biodiversity, they are too monotonous. For the Climate Convention, they were considered to be too small. For the Desertification Convention, they were considered to be too wet. And to all, they were considered to be frightful. And to all, they were a norm. The Ramsar Convention, in the framework of which the World Wetlands Day is happening, actually overlooked peatlands during 25 years. 25 years, they have not paid attention to peatlands. And that was very surprising, because actually we have discovered that the city of Ramsar is surrounded by peatlands. And here you see a picture of Elias Ramazani, a postdoc of mine, coring peat in the park belonging to the hotel at the background, where the Ramsar Convention was first signed in 1971, I think. So Ramsar is actually peatland, but peatlands have been forgotten. I think that in pre-Neolithic Europe, peatlands were very important, because peatlands were the only open spots in the landscape where you could walk. Other open landscapes were only lakes and seas and rivers, but you cannot walk over water if you're not Jesus Christ. So they must have been incredibly important for the people. And if you are standing in an open peatland, like most of our Central European peatlands are, and you are always standing in a circle. The horizon shapes itself like a circle, and the circle is the most perfect, the most holy form there is. The importance of an open landscape is that it gives you a different perspective. It actually gives you perspective. This is very nicely described in a study of Colin Turnbull, an anthropologist, when he was studying the small people, the pygmies as they call, in the forest of Congo. I have lived myself several weeks with pygmies when I was a boy of 20, and it was an impressive time of my life. But Colin Turnbull brought one of his friends to the Ruwenzori, and they climbed over the tree line, and then they looked down in the savannas, where they say zebras and gnus and wildebeest and all things. And then suddenly his friend said, "What insects are those?" Because if you always live in the forests, you do not learn yourself the idea that something that is much farther away is also smaller. So peatlands must have been very important in former times, in pre-Neolithic times in Europe, because they were given literally another perspective. They were an open connection between the sky above and the underworld below, and separated by swamp, something, swimming, something not stable where you could still walk on. It was not water. And this is also shown by the fact that wet peatlands have been a place where enormous amount of sacrifices have been brought in. Here, a collection of findings from the Torsberger Moor. Many gold and silver and all kinds of things have been found in the peatlands. They were sacrificed to the peatland. And even people have been sacrificed. We have now in Europe some 500 Borg bodies, and they have not drowned, and it was not an accident. These people have been brought there. They have been brought there, and it has been shown recently that many have died several deaths. They were strangled, their neck was cut open, they were beaten, etc., etc., to increase the transition between life and death. They are conserved forever, showing the importance of open peatlands in our civilization. But now, this positive attitude has completely disappeared. So we were wondering, how and when did this negative attitude start, also for the purpose to maybe change this attitude again? And that is the project where Victor was talking about, which practically largely Pim de Klerk is doing. He is studying all these old documents, the oldest written and depicted testimonies on the perception of wetlands and peatlands, everything that has been written before 500 of the Christian era. And this is the area that we, specifically Pim, is working on. It is Mesopotamia, it is Israel and surroundings, it is Egypt, it is Greece, it is Rome, etc. But now, of course, we are focusing on the Middle East. Here a picture of Egypt, which was maybe a little bit later also a very important culture where wetlands played an important role. Actually, heaven of the Egyptians was thought to be a wetland. So we are now focusing on Iraq and its surroundings, an area very interesting from a geomorphological point of view. Here is a map that Pim newly made, with in red all important cities of these immense important civilizations. This is not the map of the distribution of refugees in Europe, but it is of course strongly linked. It is the map of the distribution of agriculture. Actually, a lot of the things of our Western civilization started in the area of Iraq and surroundings. Their scripture, writing, was first discovered. Their administration was developed. And for us, very importantly, also agriculture originated there. It has even been shown recently that the old people who started agriculture in Europe, in Germany, in the Netherlands, were actually partly people from the Middle East. it was not only a dispersal of technique, it was a dispersal of genes. And so that's why the slogan of today is so important. We all have Iraq blood in our genes. But this idea, this origin of agriculture from this area also provided the idea that productive land must be dry. And this is actually an illusion that we worldwide apply to wet organic soils, creating huge environmental problems. So it is important to notice where all these things are coming from. All the lands were sea, and Jilima bound reeds upon the face of the waters. He formed soil and poured it out beside the reeds. He filled in a dike by the side of the sea, and he made a swamp. Reeds he formed, trees he created. This is Sumerian creation myth of 4,500 years ago. This idea that wetlands were the start of creation has been always there. Jilima, the name that was pronounced in the beginning, is actually containing the word G, that means reed, and Jilim meaning foliage or rope of twined reeds. In Babylon in the 17th century before Christian era, we had even minor gods with EGG. You see 2 times the G in it, reed. Gods were that, and they had to dig canals. But it was heavy work, they thought, and they rebelled. And then the higher gods decided to create other creatures to take over the tasks. And these creatures were humans. Humans were created to work in the swamps. Also, the ancient Sumerian name Kengi for the Sumerian Babylonian regions means the land of canals and reeds. This area has its identity by wetlands. And we see also that the most important Mesopotamian gods, there were something like 3,000 Mesopotamian gods, were related to wetlands. We had Enki, one of the most important of all. He was the god of water and wetlands. We had Jilima already mentioned in Sumeria. That's the same as Marduk in Babylon. He was also the god of water and vegetation. We had Enkimdu, the god of dikes and canals. We had Enugu, the lord and inspector of canals and dikes. And we had Nanse, the goddess of marshes, fishes, and birds. The most important Mesopotamian gods were related to wetland. Enki, one of the most powerful. From here, it is described that he created marshes by masturbating and spreading his sperm over the landscape. Other translations see that he used his penis for digging ditches and building dikes. Here we see an old picture of 4,300 years old of the wetland god Enki below the red arrow, and you see how the water and the fishes streams from his shoulder and along his body. The creation myths of Mesopotamians say that there are no marshes. There were no marshes before creation. There was nothing before creation, but the marshes were among the first landscape to be created, and they were seen as incredibly important. The god Enki greeted the land of Meluha with "May your reeds be great reeds." And there is a Sumerian proverb that says, "Where there are no reeds, it is the worst of all poverty." But on the other hand, there were also some negative associations. A very nice one that Pim discovered is the Babylonian story of the worm and the tooth from the 7th century before Christian era, where it was described that caries, the tooth disease, is caused by worms that are created by the marshes. There is a direct link between caries and swamps and marshes. Already in the mid-3rd millennia before Christian era, maps were drawn on clay tablets. It was the first culture that made maps, of course, to deal with property. And here below, there is a tablet of 3,500 years old with a map found around Nippur. And here you see this map, and here is the simplification, the redrawing that Pim made of it, where you also see fields between rivers and reed marshes, etc., etc. And surprisingly, Pim found back on Google Earth the same structure as was depicted 3,500 years ago. I thought this is amazing that you find these things back. It will probably not be the same, but that these structures still survive a little bit in the landscape. The Babylonians already created the first map of the world in the 6th century before Christian era, with also indications of swamps, their cities, and of course surrounded by the ocean. There are a lot of reliefs, for example, these from the ruins of Nineveh, that depict swamps, that depict reed areas. This is from the palace of the Neo-Assyrian king Sennacherib, who lived 700 years before Christian era, who was trying to conquer the marshes in the south of Mesopotamia, which we will hear a lot. Here you see his army, and above you see how the reeds are there. And here's some details of these reeds, where you see a pig with youngsters still very abundant in these marshes, and there on the other is an antelope or whatever it is, showing already animal life in the reeds. These Assyrian troops fought with the Chaldeans, and they sheltered in the marshes. Here are the first picture of refugees, you can say, who try to find refuge in the marshes, that they are not harmed. And here last a battle scene in the Chaldean marshes, with boats and fishes and all kinds of things, and everywhere the reeds. Interestingly, and that is also a very important link to Western civilization, it was already in 1872 that George Smith, a Briton, on clay tablets with cuneiform writings, discovered that the story of the flood in the Bible was actually Mesopotamian. And that is at least 4,000 years old. And there, the idea was born already in 1872 that actually a lot of the stories in the Jewish and Christian Bible are actually stories from Mesopotamia that the Jews have adopted when they were in exile in Babylon 600 years before Christian era. So a lot of the stories that I have heard in on school and in churches, etc., are actually Mesopotamian stories. And one of the most fascinating things that I want to stop with is the discovery of a clay tablet. Actually, it was first seen, I think, in 1985, but then later, only in 2009, a person came to the British Museum and showed this tablet, and this guy, this Irvin Finkel, looked up it and he said, "This is special. And this is the beginning of the story of the Ark of Noah." But then the guy went out of the museum again and only returned back 15 years later or so, or 20 years later. But then he got hold of this tablet, and actually this tablet contains the building description how to build an ark. On this tablet, it is written that the ark should be circular, should be 3,600 square meters to lodge all the animals, and must be made out of plant fiber. The ark was made of wetland plants. And this is a very fascinating story. I have put here the YouTube link in it. It's an incredibly amazing lecture that he is giving, telling about how he discovered it and the background of these things. So I think that with this small story, I have given you an impression how important Mesopotamia has been for our civilization and Western civilization, but that different from Western civilization, in ancient Mesopotamia, wetlands were seen as beautiful and useful. And this feeling we have to gain back to save the peatlands and the wetlands. Thank you very much. Pim and I are publishing a lot of these things in the IMCG bulletin. A lot have not appeared yet because of Corona, but they will come. If you want to read it, go there, go to the website of Pim, or go to the website of IMCG, and maybe even become a member. It is for free. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans. It was extremely interesting, of course, as I expected. We trying to catch time. We don't have much time for discussion, but I want. Yes, if there are some questions from chat, Magda, maybe you can check with Marcin. We can ask them. I just want to comment that yes, I expected that you would tell this sort of erotic story of the creation of the world from marshes, but I find it beautiful. It's if you consider that the world was created by fertilizing the marshes, the wetlands, then wetlands are our mother.
Yeah. Yeah, in Christian society, this would not have happened. Huh?
Why do you think, Hans, we have forgotten about the importance of wetlands? When did it happen that we started losing the link to wetlands, that we considered them not important anymore, and draining them was more important than protecting them? And
yeah, the idea that we now have is that it started with the Greek, and that it became really common sense with the Romans. And we have been thinking even by that it has to do with the fact that Rome is actually built on 7 hills, the 7 hills of Rome, that are separated by wetlands and even by peatlands. And there they started draining to connect these centers of urbanization with each other. The Cloaca Maxima, which is now a sewage canal, was actually a drainage ditch started with, and all kinds of important things like the Circus Maximus that you see from the FAO building was actually a wetland. So in Rome, wetlands were interspersed in an expanding city, and this might have helped a lot. Of course, also the fear of diseases like malaria, bad air, and that is also an idea that comes up very strongly with the Romans. But the project is not ended yet. We will still work for several years on that, but we hope to find it out. Most of these texts have never been studied by ecologists and physical geographers. They have always been studied by politicians and juridical people, and it is very interesting to try to interpret these things in natural science terms.
But may I still have one word with Hans, or should we start with Tamara? One more question, because it intrigues me. If we were created to dig canals because the god was too busy or too lazy to do it himself, isn't the idea to drain the marshes present already in the earliest cultures? Wasn't our plan to drain the marshes from the very beginning, from Mesopotamia?
No, I think that the canals were not so much dug for draining the area, but for irrigating the area.
Okay.
It was a distribution more of water than a draining. The reeds were very productive areas and also used for all kinds of purposes, for building, for food, etc., etc.
And communication probably as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hoped for this answer. I think we will have a chance to talk to you more during the general discussion. Thank you very much indeed.